The sun blazed down on Seattle, turning the city into a sweltering oven. The kind of heat that clung to your skin and made every breath feel heavy. The air shimmered above the asphalt, distorting the bustling streets and the noisy docks in the distance. Amid the chaos of honking horns and the chatter of pedestrians, Captain Grant Cooper stood like a predator surveying his territory. His sharp eyes, framed by a face weathered by years of wielding authority, locked onto a nondescript sedan weaving through traffic. His broad shoulders squared beneath his crisp uniform, a steel resolve glinting in his movements as he adjusted the badge pinned to his chest. A badge he wore like a crown. Today felt different to him, though he couldn't quite place why. Maybe it was the heat frying his nerves, or maybe it was the thrill of power surging through his veins as he spotted his next target. Rachel Anderson. Rachel, a D agent buried deep undercover, gripped the steering wheel with hands that trembled ever so slightly, not from fear, but from the electric anticipation coursing through her. She wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead, pushing her damp brown hair back beneath the faded baseball cap that shielded her face. 6 months. 6 grueling months of living a lie, of smiling at monsters, of pretending to be someone she wasn't. Today was the culmination of it all. Her chest burned with a fire hotter than the Seattle sun, her heart hammering against her ribs as she glanced at the dashboard clock. Every tick brought her closer to dismantling Victor Reynolds' Empyrea pharmaceutical trafficking ring that had sunk its claws into the city, poisoning its streets with drugs disguised as medicine. She'd played her role flawlessly, a corrupt businesswoman inching her way into Reynolds' inner circle, earning his trust with every calculated word. Now, the finish line was in sight, and justice felt so close she could almost taste it. Her phone buzzed sharply against the passenger's seat, jolting her from her thoughts. She snatched it up, her pulse quickening as she read the message from her handler. Agent Luke Matthews, Reynolds' shipment is hitting the port today. Intel's solid, Rachel. It's time. Her breath caught in her throat. This was the moment she'd sacrificed everything for. She could picture Luke's steady voice, his calm demeanor masking the urgency of the operation. He'd been her anchor through this storm, the one person she could rely on when the weight of her double life threatened to crush her. She exhaled slowly, steadying her nerves as she maneuvered through the crowded streets, the city pulsing around her like a living, breathing beast. Seattle was alive that day, its sidewalks teeming with people desperate to escape the heat. Tourists clustered around the towering skyscrapers, their cameras flashing as they captured the gleaming Space Needle against the hazy sky. Locals darted into shaded cafes, clutching iced coffees and fanning themselves with newspapers. The traffic crawled, a symphony of engines and impatient horns filling the air. But Rachel's mind was elsewhere, locked on the port, on Reynolds, on the justice she'd promised herself she'd deliver. She barely noticed the chaos around her until a flicker of white caught her eye. In the rearview mirror, a white SUV trailed behind her, its movements too precise to be chance. Her stomach tightened as she watched it mirror her turns, keeping just enough distance to avoid suspicion, but close enough to set her instincts ablaze. She muttered a curse under her breath, "Not today, damn it," and gripped the wheel harder, her knuckles whitening. She made a sharp right onto a quieter street, the tires squealing faintly against the pavement. The SUV followed. Another turn, this one sudden and tight, her eyes darting between the road and the mirror. It was still there, relentless, a shadow she couldn't shake. Adrenaline surged through her, years of training kicking in as her mind raced to calculate her next move. Who were they? Reynolds' men? Someone else? She couldn't afford to find out, not when she was this close. Before she could decide, her radio crackled to life, a burst of static slicing through the tension. She reached for it, her fingers brushing the device, when red and blue lights erupted in her mirror. A police vehicle. Her heart sank. "No, no, no," she whispered, pulling over to the side of the road, her thoughts spinning out of control. This wasn't part of the plan. Local law enforcement had no business in her operation zone. She fumbled for her badge in the glove compartment, her hands steadied despite the storm brewing inside her. Whatever this was, she'd handle it. She was a federal agent, after all. No beat cop could derail her now. The officer who approached her window loomed large, his shadow falling over her like a dark cloud. Captain Grant Cooper's graying hair gleamed in the sunlight, a stark contrast to the cold, unyielding lines of his face. His voice cut through the air like a blade. License and registration. Rachel met his gaze, her own eyes steady as she held up her credentials, her badge glinting in the harsh light. Captain, I'm Agent Rachel Anderson with the D. I'm in the middle of an active operation, and this stop is interfering with that. Her tone was calm, professional, but beneath it, unease coiled like a snake ready to strike. Cooper's eyes flickered to her badge for a fleeting moment, a shadow of doubt crossing his face before it hardened into something darker. He sneered, his lip curling with disdain. Step out of the vehicle. Rachel's stomach plummeted, a cold dread washing over her. This wasn't right. She tried again, her voice firm despite the tremor threatening to break through. I don't think you understand, Captain. I'm a federal agent on an active investigation. Contact your supervisor if you need to verify. His response was immediate, sharp, and commanding. Step out of the vehicle. The words rang out, drawing the attention of passers-by who slowed their steps, phones slipping from pockets as they began to record. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest, a frantic rhythm she fought to control. This was spiraling too fast. She couldn't afford a scene out with Reynolds' shipment so close, not with everything on the line. Captain, I'm complying, she said, her voice steady as she reached for the door handle. But you need to know this is interfering with a federal operation. She moved slowly, deliberately, every muscle tense as she stepped onto the pavement. But before her feet could fully settle, Cooper's hand shot out, seizing her arm with a grip like iron. He yanked her forward, spinning her round and slamming her against the side of her car with a force that knocked the breath from her lungs. The metallic click of handcuffs locking around her wrists sent a jolt through her, the cold steel biting into her skin. Who do you think you are, waltzing into my city like this? Cooper growled, his voice thick with contempt, his breath hot against her ear. Rachel winced, pain radiating from her wrists, but she refused to let him see her falter. The crowd swelled around them, a sea of curious faces and flashing cameras, their whispers rising like a tide. She caught sight of another officer standing by the white SUV, leaner, with dark hair and a hesitant posture, his name tag read Officer Jake Rivera. Their eyes met for a brief second, and in his gaze, she saw something flicker uncertainty, maybe even guilt. He shifted uncomfortably, his hand hovering near his radio as if debating whether to act. Captain, Rivera ventured, his voice softer, tinged with unease. She's got federal credentials. Shouldn't we at least verify with someone? Cooper's head snapped toward him, his glare a silent warning that could have stopped a charging bull. Get back in the car, Rivera. I'll handle this. Rivera hesitated, his jaw tightening, but he obeyed. Retreating to the SUV with a reluctant step, Rachel's mind raced. Cooper wasn't just a rogue cough, was something more, something dangerous. She could feel it in the way he moved, the way he wielded his authority like a weapon. He was tied to Reynolds. She was sure of it now. Her chest tightened as Cooper shoved her toward his unmarked SUV, each step a march into uncertainty. The pavement burned beneath her boots, the heat seeping through the soles as she fought to keep her composure. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, a chorus of outrage and confusion, but she couldn't focus on them. Her thoughts churned, piecing together the puzzle. Cooper's aggression wasn't random, it was calculated. He wasn't just flexing his power. He was protecting something, someone, and she held the key to unraveling it all, a secret buried deep in the intel she gathered, a thread that could pull apart the web of corruption he thrived in. Inside, Rachel burned with a quiet fury. She'd spent months clawing her way toward justice, risking everything to expose the untouchable men like Reynolds, and now men like Cooper. This wasn't just a clash of wills, it was a reckoning. Cooper thought he was invincible, a king in a kingdom built on lies and fear. But he didn't know what she knew, didn't see the storm she was about to unleash. Justice wasn't just her mission, it was her weapon. And as the cuffs dug into her wrists, as the crowd's phones captured every humiliating second, she vowed she wouldn't be silenced, not by him, not by anyone. Meanwhile, Rivera lingered by the SUV, his fingers tapping nervously against the door. He wasn't like Cooper, his eyes didn't carry that same hunger for control. He'd joined the force to help people, to make a difference, but lately, he'd felt the weight of something rotten pressing down on him. Cooper's orders had grown sharper, his actions more erratic, and Rivera couldn't shake the feeling that he was being pulled into something he didn't sign up for. Watching Rachel, her calm defiance, her unshaken resolve stirred something in him, doubt, maybe even hope. He didn't know her story yet, but he sensed she was fighting for something bigger than herself, and in that moment, he wondered if he'd have the courage to do the same when the time came. The heat pressed on, relentless, as the scene unfolded, a dirty cop tightening his grip on power, an agent clinging to her mission, and a young officer teetering on the edge of a choice. The streets of Seattle buzzed with life, oblivious to the battle brewing in their midst. But for Rachel, every second was a step toward the truth, a fight against a system that thrived on deception. Cooper's arrogance, his abuse of authority, would be his undoing. To make sure of it, justice wasn't just a goal, it was a force, one that would strip away the masks of those who thought they could rule through fear. And as she stumbled forward, hands bound, she carried that force within her, unyielding, ready to strike. The night air hung heavy with secrecy, a shroud that cloaked Rachel's every move as she executed her covert operation. No one was meant to uncover her plans, let alone derail them so abruptly. Yet here she was, her heart thudding against her ribcage, as Cooper's firm grip steered her toward the waiting SUV. The streetlights cast fleeting shadows across her face, illuminating the tension etched into her features. As they moved, her eyes darted sideways, catching sight of Officer Jake Rivera lingering near the edge of the scene. His face was a mask of unease, brow furrowed, lips pressed into a tight line, his dark eyes flickering between her and Cooper with a restlessness that betrayed his discomfort. For a fleeting second, their gazes locked. It was brief, a mere heartbeat, but it was enough. In that sliver of time, Rachel saw something, the flicker of doubt, a crack in the armor of loyalty he wore. It wasn't much, but it was a lifeline, a fragile thread of hope whispering that Rivera hadn't fully surrendered to the corruption that consumed Cooper. She clung to it, her mind racing with the possibility that he could be her way out. But before she could dwell on it, Cooper's rough hands shoved her forward, forcing her into the back seat of the vehicle. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound reverberating like a judge's gavel, sealing her fate with a chilling finality. Inside the SUV, the air was stifling, thick with the scent of leather and sweat. Rachel's wrists burned where the handcuffs bit into her skin, the metal warming against her flesh as though it were alive, feeding off her growing panic. But it wasn't the physical pain that weighed on her, it was the crushing realization of how dire this moment had become. This wasn't a mere hiccup in her mission. It was a catastrophe threatening to unravel everything she'd fought for. The engine roared to life, its growl cutting through the stillness of the city streets as the vehicle lurched forward. Rachel pressed her cheek against the cold glass of the window, her breath fogging the surface as she strained to memorize every twist and turn of their route. The world outside blurred into a mosaic of unfamiliar streets and shadowed alleys, each one stretching endlessly into the unknown. This wasn't a standard arrest, she knew that much. Cooper wasn't just a rogue officer with a chip on his shoulder, was a cog in a much larger, far darker machine. Her chest tightened as she fought to steady her breathing, her mind scrambling for any chance to break free. Deep down, though, a gnawing truth settled in her gut. She was utterly at the mercy of a man who wielded more power than she could counter, a man who'd been in league with Reynolds all along. The revelation struck her like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. Cooper's voice sliced through the tense silence, sharp and mocking, as if he relished her dawning horror. "You really thought you could waltz into Seattle and take down Reynolds, didn't you?" He sneered, his tone dripping with contempt. "This is my city, and you're nothing here." Rachel's heart stuttered, but she refused to let him see her falter. "You're working for him, aren't you?" she shot back, her voice cutting through the fear that clawed at her chest. It was a gamble, a desperate stab at the truth, but she needed to hear it confirmed. Cooper's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, meeting hers for an instant. His expression remained stony, unyielding, but there was a cold, calculating glint in his gaze that sent a shiver down her spine. "Reynolds keeps the peace in this town," he muttered, his words laced with a twisted sense of righteousness. "No gang wars, no chaos. People stay in line, and everyone gets their cut. That's how the world spins, and Yoai wouldn't get it." Rachel's voice dropped to a fierce whisper, her anger simmering beneath the surface. "I understand more than you think. People are dying because of him, because of you. And you call that peace?" Cooper's lips curled into a sneer, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Sometimes keeping the peace means getting your hands dirty," he snapped. "Reynolds has his reasons. He makes this city work. You don't know the first thing about how it runs." Her jaw clenched, her mind reeling with the weight of his words. "I know enough," she countered, her tone sharp and unwavering. "I know about the overdoses, the kids dying from tainted drugs. What's your excuse for that?" His fist slammed against the dashboard with a force that made her flinch, the sudden violence echoing in the confined space. "Casualties happen in every business," he growled. "Better this way, no chaos. No gangs tearing the streets apart. Reynolds keeps it clean." She bit back the retort that burned on her tongue. This wasn't the time for a moral standoff with a man so entrenched in his own corruption. Time was slipping away, and she needed to focus. Yet, even amidst the rising dread, her thoughts drifted back to Rivera. From the moment he'd hesitated at the traffic stop, something about him had struck her as different. His uncertainty wasn't just a fleeting lapse, it was a fracture, a sign that he hadn't fully crossed the line. She'd seen it in the way his shoulders tensed, the way his eyes lingered on her with a mix of guilt and indecision. He wasn't like Cooper. Not yet. She wanted to believe he was still a good cop, that some shred of integrity lingered beneath the pressure of this corrupt world. But as the SUV barreled down narrow, deserted streets, it became painfully clear that Cooper had no intention of delivering her to a police station. They were headed somewhere else, somewhere isolated, somewhere she might never escape. The cityscape shifted outside her window, the vibrant pulse of Seattle fading into a labyrinth of forgotten corners. Rachel pressed harder against the glass, her eyes tracing the route as the streets grew tighter, lined with crumbling buildings and shattered windows. She committed every detail to memorize a mental map that could be her only lifeline. If she got the chance to run, the SUV veered onto an isolated road, and her pulse quickened, hammering in her ears. They were approaching the warehouse district, a desolate sprawl of abandoned structures where the law held no sway. It was a place where shadows ruled, where anything could happen unseen and unheard. Her instinct screamed at her this was the moment to act, to seize any sliver of opportunity. She stole a glance out the rear window, catching sight of Rivera's car trailing at a distance, its headlights dim behind a dilapidated building. Was he following them? Did he suspect something? The faint glimmer of hope flickered in her chest, fragile but alive. Cooper yanked the wheel hard, the tires screeching as the SUV skidded into the lot of an abandoned warehouse. The sudden stop jolted her forward, the silence that followed pressing down like a physical weight. Beyond the cracked concrete and rusted metal, the distant hum of the city felt like a world away, leaving them in a pocket of oblivion. Her heart pounded as Cooper flung open the door with a brutal jerk, his hands rough as he dragged her out. She stumbled, the gravel biting into her shoes, and he shoved her toward the warehouse entrance. The heavy door groaned on its hinges as it swung shut behind them, the sound a mournful dirge that cut them off from the outside world. Inside, the air was damp and stale, the darkness swallowing the faint light that seeped through broken windows. Rachel's breath hitched, her nerves fraying, but she refused to crumble. She wasn't alone and not entirely. Rivera was still out there, a silent witness to this unfolding nightmare. He was her last card to play, the one thread that might pull her back from the brink. As Cooper loomed over her, his presence radiating menace, Rachel's mind churned with the lessons this moment laid bare. Justice wasn't a gift handed down, it was a battle, fought tooth and nail against those who twisted power for their own gain. Cooper and Reynolds embodied that abuse, their hands stained with the blood of a city they claimed to protect. Yet in Rivera, she saw the flicker of something else, a conscience, perhaps, or the remnants of a man who hadn't yet forgotten what it meant to stand for something. The consequences of their choices rippled outward, a stark reminder that power unchecked was a poison, eroding everything it touched. Rachel steeled herself, her resolve hardening. She wouldn't let this be the end. Not here, not now. The fight for justice and her own survival had only just begun. A cold sweat trickled down Rachel's spine as the SUV barreled through the desolate streets. the engine's growl reverberating in her chest like a death knell. Dread gnawed at her insides, a relentless beast whispering that if she didn't find a way out soon, this ride would mark the end of her career, her life, everything she'd fought for. Her breath hitched, shallow and sharp, as her eyes darted across the urban wasteland outside the window. Then, a flicker of movement caught her attention. A sleek black sedan tucked discreetly around a corner, its polished surface glaringly out of place amid the crumbling brick and shattered glass of this forgotten part of the city. Her heart leapt, a surge of fragile hope igniting within her. It was Rivera. He was here. He hadn't abandoned her, hadn't fully succumbed to the corruption that choked this place. Even tangled in his own web of compromised loyalties, he was still reaching for something right, something just. Rachel clung to that thought, her fingers tightening into fists as she willed herself to stay sharp, to wait for the perfect moment to signal him. But doubt crept in, insidious and cold. What if she couldn't reach him? What if time slipped through her fingers like sand? Worse yet, what if Cooper, the hulking figure beside her, caught wind of Rivera's presence and crushed that fleeting hope before it could bloom? The SUV lurched into a series of jagged turns, each one jolting Rachel's body against the worn leather seat and sending fresh waves of panic crashing through her. She forced herself to focus, her mind racing to catalog every detail of the routed way the cracked asphalt twisted around. Skeletal buildings, the rusted street signs leaning like weary sentinels, the faint glint of a broken bottle catching the dim streetlight. Every turn etched itself into her memory, a mental map she couldn't afford to lose. One misstep, one forgotten detail, and she'd be stranded in this nightmare with no way back. The city sprawled around them, an endless maze of abandoned warehouses and hollowed-out shells, their windows gaping like empty eyes staring down at her plight. She couldn't shake the feeling that these streets were a living thing, a beast that swallowed people whole and spat out their bones. Cooper's voice sliced through her spiraling thoughts, rough and grating, dripping with arrogance. "You think you can change anything? You can't. This city belongs to me." Reynolds keeps it all humming along. Without him, it'd collapse into chaos. His words hung heavy in the air, a proclamation of warped pride. Rachel's fists clenched tighter, her nails digging into her palms as a hot surge of frustration boiled up inside her. She turned to him, her voice steady despite the fire raging in her chest. "You really believe that? You think he's the glue holding this place together? He's a cancer. Cooper, I've seen the body Eskeds overdosing on his poison, families torn apart. How do you look at that and still live with yourself? How do you close your eyes at night knowing you're part of it?" For a fleeting moment, something flickered across Cooper's faceous knuckles, whitening on the steering wheel, his jaw tightening as if her words had struck a buried nerve. Was it anger, regret? No, it was deeper, a shadow of something raw and unguarded that made Rachel's breath catch. But just as quickly, it vanished, his expression hardening into a mask of cold resolve. "Shut up," he muttered, his voice low and venomous, barely above a growl. "You don't get it. You don't know how this world works. You think you're some savior, but you're nothing, just a pawn in a game you can't win." Rachel eased back into her seat, a faint smirk tugging at her lips despite the tension coiling in her gut. She'd rattled him, his defensiveness, his bristling anger. It was a crack in his armor, a glimpse of vulnerability she could exploit. Maybe, just maybe, she could turn his own ego against him. The SUV slowed as they approached a massive rusted gate, its hinges groaning in protest as it creaked open to reveal a sprawling complex of decaying warehouses. Rachel's stomach twisted into knots, a visceral warning that danger loomed closer with every passing second. This was the crucible where her fate would be forged. She didn't know if Rivera could reach her in time, didn't know if he'd even try. But she couldn't sit idle and let Cooper dictate her end. As the vehicle rolled to a stop, she drew a deep, steadying breath, steeling herself for what came next. She wouldn't go quietly. She'd fight, claw her way out of this abyss with every ounce of strength she had. Cooper killed the engine, and the silence that followed was suffocating, thick with unspoken threats. Beyond the windshield, the faint hum of distant traffic mingled with the occasional rumble of the city world that felt impossibly far away from this forsaken place. The odds were stacked against her, a towering wall she could barely see over. But as long as her heart kept beating, she'd keep pushing forward. The SUV screeched to a halt in front of a hulking warehouse, its walls sagging under the weight of neglect, paint peeling away like dead skin. The stillness that settled over them was oppressive, a prelude to the storm she knew was coming. Her pulse thundered in her ears, instinct screaming that this was the edge of the snow turning back now. They'd plunged deep into Seattle's industrial underbelly, a graveyard of rusted machinery and broken dreams where screams would dissolve into the wind, unnoticed and unheard. This was where people vanished, their stories erased by the shadows. Rachel refused to let that be her legacy. Cooper's hand clamped onto the door handle, his movements slow and deliberate, exuding a quiet menace that made the air feel heavier. He didn't need words to convey his intent. This was the endgame, and he held all the cards. Rachel's mind churned, grasping for any shred of advantage. She flicked her gaze to the rearview mirror, desperation clawing at her as she searched for Rivera's sedan. But the street stretched empty behind them, a barren void mocking her hope. She was alone, teetering on the precipice with no lifeline in sight. The door creaked open, and before she could brace herself, Cooper yanked her out of the SUV, his grip on her arm brutal, promising bruises she'd feel for days if she survived that long. The handcuffs bit into her wrists, cold metal grinding against her skin, but she swallowed the rising panic, forcing her breaths to stay even. Fear was a luxury she couldn't indulge. Action was her only salvation now. "Move," Cooper barked, shoving her toward the warehouse entrance. Her shoes scraped against the gravel, the harsh sound slicing through the eerie quiet, amplifying the dread pooling in her chest. The building loomed ahead, its cracked walls rising like a fortress of despair, shadows stretching long and jagged across the ground. The air hung thick with the stench of rust and oil, a bitter tang that coated her tongue and made her stomach churn. Beyond the warehouse, the city's distant pulse was a faint whisper, smothered by the oppressive decay surrounding them. This was a lawless realm, a pocket of darkness where justice was a forgotten myth, and Rachel felt its weight pressing down on her with every step. The warehouse door groaned open as Cooper pushed her inside, revealing a cavernous space that swallowed the light. The ceiling soared high above, casting eerie shadows that danced across the cracked concrete floor. Dim beams of sunlight pierced through grime-streaked windows, illuminating motes of dust that floated like ghosts in the stagnant air. Piles of discarded junk-rusted pipes, splintered crates, and twisted metal littered the corners, remnants of lives and deals long abandoned. Cooper steered her deeper into the gloom, his presence a looming threat at her back. Rachel's eyes darted around, mapping the room for any escape. A few exits dotted the far walls, but they might as well have been miles away. She'd never reach them before he caught her. "Sit," he ordered, pointing to a weathered wooden crate in the corner. His voice was rough, worn down by years of embracing the darkness he now served. She hesitated, her mind still whirring, before lowering herself onto the crate, every nerve on edge as she calculated her next move. She had to stall, had to keep him talking. Information was her weapon now. Every word he let slip could be a key to unraveling Reynolds' empire, to turning this nightmare around. "You're not the first agent I've seen try to take down Reynolds," Cooper said, pacing before her, his boots scuffing against the concrete. A sneer twisted his lips, his eyes glinting with cruel amusement. "Not even the second. But here's the thing, sweetheart, you'll be the last." Rachel didn't flinch, didn't let his taunts shake her. She met his gaze, her voice calm but edged with steel. "What's it like working for him? Does it make you feel strong, knowing you can ruin lives and never face the consequences?" Cooper's pacing faltered, his eyes narrowing as her words hung between them. "Power's a funny thing," he said, his tone shifting, almost reflective. "You either wield it or you don't. Reynolds makes sure we all get our share. He runs these streets, keeps the peace in a city that'd tear itself apart without him." Rachel's eyes blazed, her resolve hardening. "Peace? What about the people dying because of him? The kids choking on his drugs? How do you justify that and still call it peace?" His face darkened, a storm brewing behind his eyes, and for a moment, she thought she'd pierced through his bravado. But then his jaw clenched, his voice turning cold. "Casualties happen, that's the cost. Reynolds keeps the gangs in check, stops the chaos. Without him, this city would burn. Trust me, it's better this way." Her stomach twisted, a sickening mix of anger and disgust rising in her throat. She could feel the heat of her fury threatening to spill over, but she reined it in, knowing it wouldn't serve her here. Cooper wasn't just a cog in Reynolds' machina, was a believer. A man who'd convinced himself his crimes were noble, that delusion was his weakness, and she'd wield it like a blade. "So that's how you sleep at night," she said, her voice soft but laced with venom. "You tell yourself you're the hero, that it's all for some greater good." He stopped pacing, turning to face her fully, his eyes flashing with a fury that betrayed his calm facade. "You don't get it," he snapped. "You don't understand how this city survives. You think you can waltz in with your badge and your ideals and fix it all, but you're wrong. Reynolds is the only one who knows how to hold it together." Rachel held his stare, her mind a whirlwind of strategy and resolve. She'd keep pushing, keep him off balance, keep him talking. Every second she bought was a second closer to Rivera, a second closer to turning the tables. Justice wasn't just about taking down Reynolds, it was about exposing the rotten men like Cooper. Men who abused their power and called it virtue. The consequences of their choices would catch up, and she'd make damn sure she was there when they did. In the dimly lit warehouse, the air was heavy with the stench of rust and desperation, clinging to every corner like a suffocating shroud. Rachel stood there, her wrists chafed from the coarse ropes binding them, her breath shallow but deliberate. She knew one thing with unshakable certainty: a man like Cooper, a crooked cop drenched in arrogance, thrived on his own inflated sense of self. His kind always did. They couldn't resist the sound of their own voices, spilling their pride like cheap whiskey. All she needed was the perfect moment, a crack in his armor, and she'd wedge herself in deep. "You really think Reynolds gives a damn about this city?" she said, her voice a low, deliberate murmur, curling through the stale air like smoke. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes locked on his, coaxing him to listen, to feel the weight of her words. "He doesn't care about anyone but himself. The second you stop being his tool, Cooper, you're nothing to him, just trash he'll toss aside without a second thought." Her tone was soft but sharp, a blade wrapped in velvet, slicing at the fragile threads of his ego. Cooper's reaction was immediate, visceral, his face twisted into a mask of raw fury, his lips curling back as if he could snarl her words away. His meaty hand clamped onto the edge of a battered metal crate, the kind littered with dents and scratches from years of rough use. His knuckles blanched white under the strain, veins bulging beneath his skin as if they might burst. "Shut your damn mouth," he spat, his voice a venomous hiss, flecks of spit catching the faint light filtering through a cracked window high above. "You don't know a thing, you little—" He cut himself off, his chest heaving. But Rachel could see it, the flicker of doubt behind his rage, a shadow he couldn't quite shake. She wasn't about to let up. Not now, not when she could feel the ground shifting beneath him. "Oh, I know plenty," she countered, her voice rising with a quiet strength that seemed to echo off the warehouse's grimy walls. She straightened her spine, her defiance blooming despite the ache in her shoulders from hours of captivity. "I know about Detective James Porter. I know how Reynolds dealt with him when he got too greedy, when he started asking for a bigger cut of the pie. You think you're any different, Cooper? You're just another pawn on his board, same as Porter was." Her words hung there, heavy and deliberate, each one a stone dropped into the still waters of his confidence, rippling out to unsettle him. Cooper froze, his entire body locking up as if she'd struck him. The color drained from his ruddy face, leaving it a sickly gray, and his eyes narrowed into slits, glinting with a mix of suspicion and dread. "You're lying," he growled, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. It wasn't the steady bark of a man in control, it was the snarl of a cornered animal, uncertain and fraying at the edges. His fingers twitched against the crate, the metal creaking faintly under his grip, and for a fleeting moment, Rachel wondered if he might lunge at her, silence her with his fists instead of his words. She leaned forward as much as her restraints allowed, her gaze unwavering, piercing through the haze of his anger. "Am I?" she challenged, her voice steady as steel. "Go ahead, ask Reynolds about it. Or better yet, ask yourself this: what happens when you're no longer useful to him? When he decides you're more trouble than you're worth?" Her heart thudded against her ribcage, a wild, frantic rhythm she fought to conceal. She had no guarantee this would work, no promise that she could fracture his loyalty enough to turn the tide. But she had to try. There had to be a way out of this suffocating trap, and if pushing Cooper's buttons was her only lever, she'd pull it with everything she had. The warehouse fell into a deafening silence, the kind that presses against your ears until they ache. Neither of them moved, the tension coiling tighter and tighter, a storm cloud ready to burst. Dust motes danced lazily in the slivers of light piercing the gloom, and the distant hum of the city outside felt a world away. Rachel's pulse hammered in her throat, her mind racing as she watched Cooper wrestle with the seeds of doubt she'd planted. She could see it in the way his jaw ticked, the way his shoulders hunched ever so slightly was teetering, and she needed him to fall. Then, a voice sliced through the stillness, sharp and unexpected, shattering the fragile standoff. "Captain, we need to move." It wasn't a voice Rachel knew, and that sent a jolt of adrenaline surging through her veins. Cooper's head whipped toward the doorway, his posture stiffening with fresh irritation. His rage now split between her and this new intrusion. "Not now," he barked, his voice booming off the concrete walls, but the stranger didn't flinch. The urgency in their tone was unmistakable, a taut wire of insistence that refused to snap. Rachel's heart skipped, then raced faster. Someone else was here. Simeon was coming. Her thoughts spun wildly. Could it be Rivera, her old partner, the one man she'd trusted to have her back? She pictured him storming in, his broad frame filling the doorway, his steady hands ready to pull her out of this mess. Or was it someone darker, another of Reynolds' enforcers sent to tie up loose ends? She held her breath, every muscle coiled, waiting for the answer to reveal itself. The voice rang out again, louder this time, cutting through the heavy air like a gunshot. "Captain, we need to move. It's time to go." Cooper's jaw clenched so tight Rachel thought his teeth might crack, and he took a reluctant step toward the sound, his boots scuffing against the gritty floor. "What's the damn rush?" he muttered, his frustration boiling over, spilling into every word. "We're fine here. The girl's not going anywhere." But even as he said it, there was a hollowness to his bravado, a crack in the facade he'd built around himself. Rachel's eyes darted around the room, taking in every detail with desperate precision. The newcomer's presence shifted everything. Whoever they were, they had authority to make Cooper bristle, enough to give him orders he couldn't outright ignore. She could feel it in the way the air changed, the way power tilted away from Cooper and toward this unseen figure. Her stomach twisted as the realization sank in. Reynolds' corruption ran deeper than she'd imagined, a sprawling web of control that snared not just street-level crooks, but men like Cooper, men who thought they were untouchable. This wasn't just a fight against a dirty cop, it was a war against an empire. From the shadows near the doorway, a figure emerged, stepping into the faint light with a confidence that chilled her to the bone. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his silhouette a dark, imposing wall against the flickering glow of a distant street lamp, filtering through the broken windows. His movements were deliberate, each step echoing with purpose, the kind of assurance that came from wielding power without question. Rachel's gaze flicked to Cooper, and for a split second, she caught a flash of something like fear in his eyes, a crack in his usual swagger. Whatever this man wanted, it wasn't good for her. That much was as clear as the cold sweat prickling down her spine. "Captain," the man said again, his voice low and firm, carrying an edge of impatience that brooked no argument. "We have no time for your games. Reynolds expects this to be handled cleanly. Now get it together." His tone was steady, commanding, the kind that didn't need volume to make itself felt. He was older than Cooper, his face weathered by years of hard choices, lines etched deep around his mouth and eyes. His dark coat hung heavy on his frame, and the way he stood, arms crossed, shoulders squared, made it clear he was no stranger to bending others to his will. Rachel's chest tightened as she studied him, her mind scrambling to place him. He wasn't just some lackey, this was a man who thrived in the shadows, who kept Reynolds' machine running smoothly while others took the fall. Cooper's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of his predicament pressing down on him like a physical force. "Fine," he muttered, his anger still simmering, a low growl beneath the surface. "I'm going, but don't think for one damn second you get to push me around." His words were defiant, but they rang hollow, a child's tantrum against a storm he couldn't control. The man didn't respond, didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to make Rachel's stomach knot tighter, her breath catching in her throat. She was in deep now, surrounded by enemies who operated with a ruthless efficiency she'd underestimated. These weren't just corrupt cops or petty thugs, they were cogs in a criminal machine, one that crushed anything in its path. As Cooper turned away from her, his back rigid with suppressed rage, she seized the moment to scan the room again. The door was just behind them, a rusted slab of metal bolted shut, but if she could inch closer, if she could find a way to loosen her bonds, she might have a shot. Not now, moving too soon would be suicide. She needed patience, needed to think. Her eyes flicked back to the newcomer, who now stood with his arms crossed, surveying the warehouse as if he owned every inch of it. Their gazes locked for a heartbeat, and in that fleeting exchange, Rachel saw it, a coldness that went beyond greed, a hunger for control that chilled her to her core. This wasn't about money for him, it was about power, about keeping Seattle under his thumb, about proving no one could defy the system he'd helped build. She took a slow, steadying breath, the weight of her situation pressing down like a vice. But she refused to let it break her. This wasn't over, not yet. "Cooper," the man said again, his voice dropping to a soft, menacing murmur that somehow carried more threat than a shout. "The drill. Reynolds doesn't like surprises. He wants results, and he wants them now. No more mistakes." There was a finality to his words, a promise of consequences that hung in the air like a guillotine's blade. Cooper's response was tight, clipped, his face flushing red with a cocktail of shame and fury. "I know," he snapped, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "I'll make sure it gets done." But the way the man looked at him, calm, unyielding, utterly in control, made Rachel's skin crawl. This wasn't just a superior giving orders, this was the puppet master, the one who kept Cooper dancing on strings he didn't even see. The man turned his attention to her then, his steps slow and deliberate as he closed the distance between them. He didn't rush, didn't need Ta's authority, was a quiet, suffocating force. Up close, she could see the faint scars on his knuckles, the hard set of his jaw, the way his dark eyes assessed her like she was a problem to be solved. Cooper had been rattled by her words, but this man, he wasn't fazed. He stopped in front of her, his gaze steady, unblinking. "You must be Rachel Anderson," he said, his voice cool and measured, each syllable laced with a calculating calm. "I've heard a lot about you." Rachel kept her face blank, though her stomach twisted into a tighter knot. She didn't know this man, hadn't seen his face in any of the files she'd dug through, but his tone told her everything she needed to know. He was dangerous, far more than Cooper could ever hope to be. "And what have you heard?" she asked, forcing her voice to stay even, swallowing the nerves clawing up her throat. His lips curled into a thin, mirthless smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "Enough to know your trouble," he said, his words deliberate, each one a stone dropped into the silence. "And trouble has a way of getting dealt with around here." Her throat tightened, but she refused to look away. He was here to finish what Cooper had started, to ensure she didn't threaten Reynolds' grip on the city. But there was more to it. She could see it in the glint of his eyes, the way he held himself. He wasn't just here to silence her. He was here to make an example, to show her the full, merciless reach of Reynolds' power. Justice, she realized, wasn't just absent in this world, it was a joke, a fairy tale crushed under the heel of men like him. And the consequences of their unchecked power, they rippled out, poisoning everything, leaving bodies like porters in their wake. But Rachel wasn't ready to break, not yet. She had one chance, one fragile thread of hope, and she'd cling to it with everything she had. "Is that so?" she whispered, her voice barely audible but laced with steel. "Well, you'd better make sure you don't underestimate me, for a fraction of a second." His smile faltered, a flicker of uncertainty darting across his facether and gone in an instant, replaced by that same icy resolve. "You'll have your chance to prove that," he said, his tone smooth and cold as a blade. "But for now, just remember one thing, no one escapes Reynolds, no one." She met his stare, her eyes burning with a quiet defiance that refused to flicker out. "I'm not done yet," she said, her voice low but steady, a promise to herself as much as to him. He simply nodded, a faint tilt of his head, as if acknowledging a challenge he fully intended to crush. "We'll see," he replied, and the words lingered in the air, heavy with menace. The warehouse seemed to close in around her, the shadows deepening, the air growing thicker with every passing second. Rachel's mind raced, every sense sharpened to a razor's edge. His words echoed in her skull. "No one escapes Reynolds," but she shoved the fear down, buried it beneath a stubborn resolve. She'd seen corruption before, faced down men who thought they owned the world. But this was different. This was a lesson in justice twisted beyond recognition, a warning of what happens when power festers unchecked. Yet even as the weight of it pressed against her, she held fast. She wasn't just fighting for her life, she was fighting to tear it all down, to expose the rot at the heart of this city. And she'd be damned if she let them break her before she did. The air in the warehouse hung heavy, thick with tension that wrapped around Rachel like a suffocating shroud. She could feel his presence looming over her, an oppressive force that pressed against her chest, making every breath a deliberate act of defiance. This man wasn't just here to scare her, radiated a dark intent, a need to dominate every inch of this moment, ensuring that nothing, not even a federal agent like her, could derail the carefully laid plans of his master, Reynolds. His shadow stretched across the grimy concrete floor, a silent reminder of the power he wielded. And yet Rachel fought to keep her composure intact. Her pulse thrummed in her ears, but she willed her breathing to remain steady, her mind sharp as a blade. She couldn't let fear sink its claws into her now-not. When everything teetered on the edge of collapse or redemption, the silence stretched on, a taut wire ready to snap, amplifying the weight of her situation. Rachel's thoughts churned furiously, mapping out every possible escape, every tiny detail that might tip the scales in her favor. A loose nail on the floor, the faint flicker of a light bulb overhead, the distant hum of the city beyond these walls. Each fragment was a potential lifeline. She clung to them, piecing together a strategy even as the man's voice sliced through the stillness, low and venomous, dripping with disdain. "You think you've won?" he asked, his words curling like smoke around her. "You think you can waltz in here and rewrite the rules? You're nothing but a pawn, a disposable piece in this game. And trust me, you'll be swept off the board like all the rest." Rachel didn't flinch, though her heart hammered against her ribs. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with a quiet fire. "I don't need to win," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I just need to make sure you and Reynolds realize you're not untouchable." His expression remained a mask of ice, unreadable and cold. But something flickered in his eyes, a grudging respect, perhaps, or maybe just amusement at her audacity. He took a step closer, his boots scuffing against the concrete, and his voice dropped to a near whisper. "You're brave. I'll give you that. But bravery won't save you. It just makes you a bigger fool." Her chest tightened, but she refused to let him see the tremor of doubt that threatened to surface. She wasn't afraid, not of him, not of the empire Reynolds had built on corruption and blood. She knew the stakes, knew the cost of failure, but she also knew there was still a chance, however slim, to topple it all. She just had to play her cards with precision, to outmaneuver him in this suffocating chess match. Suddenly, a sound broke the tension, footsteps, faint at first, echoing from somewhere beyond the warehouse's rusted walls. Rachel's head whipped toward the noise, her heart leaping into her throat. Were they coming for her? Was this the end? The moment they dragged her away to silence her for good, the steps grew louder, then halted just outside, leaving an eerie stillness in their wake. Her mind raced, grasping for meaning, for a plan, as the pressure of her predicament bore down harder. "I told you," the man said, his voice a low growl, his eyes boring into hers with unyielding certainty. "There's no running from this. Reynolds has this city in his grip, and when we're done, you'll be nothing, not even a whisper in the wind." Rachel swallowed hard, shoving down the primal urge to panic. She wasn't finished it yet. She was too close to let it all slip away. Her fingers, hidden behind her back, worked at the handcuffs binding her wrists, each subtle twist a desperate bid for freedom. The metal bit into her skin, cold and unyielding, and every faint scrape sent a jolt of terror through her. Would he hear? She froze for a heartbeat, steadying herself, forcing the rising tide of fear back down. She couldn't afford a mistake now. His gaze sharpened, flicking to her hands as he took another step forward, suspicion narrowing his eyes. "What's this? You think you can slip away? You really believe you're calling the shots here?" Rachel met his stare, defiance blazing in her chest. "No," she said softly, her voice laced with steel, "but I've got one last move to make." Before he could react, the distant wail of sirens pierced the air, sharp and sudden, slicing through the oppressive quiet like a blade through fabric. Her heart stuttered. Could it be her team? Had they finally tracked her down? Was this the lifeline she'd been clinging to? The man's face twisted, a storm of frustration and disbelief breaking through his icy facade. "What the hell is that?" he snarled, his composure fracturing. Rachel didn't hesitate. She surged to her feet, adrenaline flooding her veins, and drove her shoulder into his chest with all the force she could muster. He staggered, caught off guard by her sudden ferocity, and for a fleeting second, she had the upper hand. Her free hand snatched a rusted metal rod from a nearby crate, and she swung it hard, forcing him back. "Get down," she shouted, her voice raw, hoping the command would buy her the precious seconds she needed to break free. He cursed, recovering faster than she'd hoped, lunging toward her with a snarl. But it was too late. The warehouse door exploded inward with a deafening crash, splinters flying as blinding light flooded the dim space. Get on the ground," a voice boomed from the threshold, authoritative and unyielding. Rachel spun, her breath catching as a team of agents stormed in, weapons drawn. Their boots pounding against the floor, relief crashed over her like a wave, dizzying and overwhelming. She'd made it. They were here. Among the swarm of agents, she spotted Cooper, his familiar figure cutting through the chaos. But his face wasn't one of triumph or relief, it was etched with confusion. His brows furrowed as he took in the scene. His eyes met hers for a fleeting moment, and in that instant, she saw something raw and unexpected: fear. The man who'd been taunting her just moments ago faltered, stepping back with his hands half raised, his bravado crumbling. "This isn't over," he spat, but his voice trembled, betraying the cracks in his confidence. The sirens outside swelled, a chorus of impending justice as more backup arrived, their lights painting the warehouse walls in flashes of red and blue. Rachel surged forward, her legs shaky but driven by a rush of adrenaline, racing toward the agents who'd become her salvation. She was trembling, her wrists raw from the cuffs, but the relief was intoxicating. She'd survived the first onslaught. The man turned to Cooper, his expression one of stunned betrayal. "I told you this wasn't the plan," he muttered, his voice tight with disbelief. But Cooper didn't answer. He was too busy grappling with the unraveling of his own world, his hands now bound as an agent snapped cuffs around his wrists. The warehouse buzzed with active agents barking orders, dragging shadowed figures into the light, cataloging evidence amidst the chaos. One approached Rachel, his hands outstretched in a gesture of reassurance. "Agent Anderson, you're safe now," he said, his tone calm but edged with urgency. She nodded, her throat tight, still struggling to steady her breathing. The weight of the ordeal crashed into her, but she pushed it aside. There was no time to falter. "Where's Rivera?" she rasped, her voice rough from strain. The agent pointed to a corner where a lean figure stood, unscathed. "He's fine. He was right behind us." Relief flooded her anew. Rivera had held fast, a quiet anchor in the storm, risking everything to back her up when hope had seemed a distant dream. She glanced at Cooper again, now fully restrained, his face a mask of fury and defeat. He'd underestimated her, and that misstep had cost him. The man who'd threatened her with Reynolds' might was led away. His once imposing presence diminished, his wrists bound like hers had been. A flicker of satisfaction sparked in her chest. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was carving her way toward victory. The warehouse pulsed with controlled chaos, a stark contrast to the suffocating stillness of moments before. Rachel stood amidst it all, her wrists throbbing, her heart still racing, caught between exhaustion and a strange, electric thrill. Reynolds remained out there, a phantom pulling strings from the shadows, but for now, she'd won this round. She let herself breathe a small, victorious breath, savoring the taste of freedom after hours of captivity. An agent approached, his face composed but his eyes warm with relief. "Agent Anderson, you okay?" She nodded, pulling herself together. "I'm fine, just need a second." "But we can't stop, Reynolds won't wait." He gave a curt nod, glancing at the detained men. "Backup's here, but you're right, this is just the beginning." His network's still out there. Determination surged through her, washing away the fatigue. She'd come too close to losing it all, but she'd clawed her way back. Now, the real fight loomed ahead. Her gaze sought Rivera again, finding him across the warehouse. His posture rigid but resolute as he spoke with another agent. When he saw her, he crossed the distance between them, his steps purposeful. "Agent Anderson," he said, his voice low, carrying the weight of their shared ordeal. "I did what I could, but it's not over, is it?" His eyes held a storm of doubt and resolve, a mirror to her own turmoil. She shook her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "No, but we're closer now. You did good, Rivera. You stayed with me when it looked impossible. I won't forget that." He returned a tight smile, one that didn't quite reach his weary eyes. "I couldn't let him keep getting away with it," he said, his voice hardening with quiet conviction. Not anymore. In that moment, Rachel saw the depth of his loyalty, the unspoken pact forged in the heat of danger. They'd faced the abyss together, and they'd emerged stronger. Justice wasn't just a goal, it was a lesson etched into their bones, a warning to those who abused power that their reign could end. The consequences were real, and Rachel intended to see them through, no matter what lay ahead. In the dim light of the warehouse, Rivera stood motionless, his breath shallow but steady. As the reality of what he'd witnessed sank deep into his bones, he could feel it now, the sprawling web of corruption, its threads weaving through every corner of the city, far more insidious than he'd ever imagined. The air around him buzzed with the chaos of the aftermath, shouts echoing off the metal walls, the clatter of handcuffs snapping shut, and the heavy thud of boots against the concrete floor as agents swarmed the scene. Rivera's chest tightened. He wasn't going to stay silent anymore, not after today. The days of turning a blind eye were over, buried beneath the weight of what he'd chosen to do. Rachel, standing close beside him, rested her hand gently on his shoulder. Her touch was light but carried a quiet strength, a small gesture meant to steady him amid the storm raging within. She could see it in his iced flicker of uncertainty, the burden of stepping into a fight so many others had avoided. Rivera wasn't just another bystander anymore. He'd crossed a line, and she knew how heavy that felt. "Whatever happens next," she said, her voice soft yet edged with unshakable conviction, "you did the right thing. You stood up for me, for the city. That's more than most would have dared." Her words hung in the air, a lifeline he wasn't sure he deserved. Rivera gave a slow nod, but his gaze drifted downward, shadowed by doubt. "I just hope it's enough," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile resolve he'd built. Before Rachel could respond, a figure emerged from the flurry of activity. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a crisp suit, his stride purposeful. Agent Anderson, one of the operations coordinators, approached with an urgency that cut through the noise. "Agent Anderson," he said, addressing Rachel directly, "Command's got a message for you. They need you for a debriefing, no?" His tone left no room for hesitation. Rachel nodded, casting a quick glance at Rivera. "I'll find you later," she promised, her eyes locking with his for a fleeting moment. "We're not done here, not by a long shot." With that, she turned and followed the agent, her steps steady despite the exhaustion tugging at her frame. As she walked away, she stole one last look at the warehouse behind her. The scene was a whirlwind of motion, agents barking orders, criminals being dragged away in cuffs, evidence bags piling up on folding tables. Yet, amid the apparent victory, a gnawing truth lingered in her mindry nodes. The puppet master was still out there, untouchable for now. The warehouse loomed like a hulking beast against the gray sky, its rusted walls and shattered windows a testament to years of neglect. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of oil and sweat, the floor littered with debris from the Radoverchern crates, scattered papers, a broken chair tipped on its side. Rachel's heart pounded as she took it all in. They'd caught a handful of Reynolds' lackeys, small fry who'd crumble under pressure, but it wasn't enough. She'd sacrificed too much sleepless nights, strained relationships, The constant ache of living on the edge of stop here. Reynolds wasn't just a criminal. He was a cancer, spreading his influence through the city's veins. And Rachel had vowed to cut him out. The thought of him slipping away again fueled her, a fire that refused to die even as fatigue clawed at her. Her mind churned as she made her way to the debriefing room, replaying the day's events in vivid detail. Cooper's arrest had been a messy affair his-wide. Panicked eyes as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. The threats spat from a mysterious figure in the shadows before he'd vanished into the chaos. Something bigger was at play, a puzzle with jagged edges that didn't yet fit. The corruption she'd uncovered today, bribes slipped into greedy hands. Officials turning blind icily deepened her resolve. Justice wasn't just a word to her. It was a debt owed to every person Reynolds had crushed under his heel. As she stepped into the debriefing room, the weight of it all pressed down harder. The operation had succeeded on paper-key players nabbed. Intel secured, but Reynolds remained a specter, haunting her every move. The room was stark, lit by harsh fluorescent bulbs that buzzed faintly overhead. A long table stretched across the center, cluttered with maps and files. While a handful of agents sat in stiff silence, Rachel sank into a chair, her body screaming for rest, but her mind raced. Her phone vibrated against her hip, and she pulled it out with a quick, practiced motion. The screen glowed with a message from her team. Reynolds spotted at the port of Seattle. Shipment inbound. Her pulse surged, a jolt of adrenaline cutting through the fog of exhaustion. This was the break she'd been chasing. Reynolds wasn't slinking away into the shadows this time. He was making his stand, and she'd be damned if she let him escape. The debriefing was brisk, almost mechanical. The lead agent, a weary man with a clipped voice, ran through the basics. Cooper in custody, evidence logged, a dozen of Reynolds' men rounded up. But Rachel's thoughts were already elsewhere, tethered to the port. As the meeting wrapped, her phone buzzed again, this time with an update from surveillance. Reynolds at Pier 34. Shipment ETA 30 minutes. Her stomach twisted, a mix of dread and anticipation. She'd hoped for a moment to breathe, to gather herself after the chaos. But Reynolds wasn't giving her that luxury. He was bold, moving his pieces even as the net tightened. She rose to her feet, decision cemented. "We move now," she declared, her voice ringing with authority. The fire in her chest flared anew, burning away the weariness. Rivera, slumped in a chair across the room, snapped to attention. His face was etched with fatigue, dark circles under his eyes, shoulders sagging, but his gaze sharpened as her words hit him. He stood without a word, his exhaustion giving way to a steely resolve. "I'm with you, Agent Anderson," he said, his tone unwavering. They'd faced too much together today: gunfire, betrayal, the raw edge of fear for him to back out now. The finish line was in sight, and he'd see it through, no matter the cost. Rachel met his eyes and nodded, a flicker of gratitude warming her. His presence grounded her, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. They moved swiftly out of the room, urgency crackling between them like static. The hallway stretched endlessly before them, its linoleum floor scuffed and dull under flickering lights. Every second felt precious, slipping through their fingers as they raced against the clock. Rachel's body ached, her muscles protesting with every step, but she pushed forward, driven by the mission. The drive to the port was a blur, the city's lights streaking past in a haze of red and gold. The weight of what lay ahead pressed down on her, suffocating in its intensity. Reynolds wasn't just expecting trouble, was ready for it. His network of spies and enforcers ensured he was never caught off guard. And Rachel knew they were walking into a lion's den. "You know he's not going to surrender quietly, right?" Rivera's voice broke the tense silence as they sped through the streets, tires humming against the asphalt. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles whitening. Rachel glanced at him, his profile sharp against the glow of the dashboard. He was right. Reynolds wasn't some desperate thug who'd fold under pressure. He'd fight with everything he had, a predator cornered but far from defeated. "I know," she replied, her voice taut with determination, "but we don't have a choice. If he gets away now, we might never get this close again." Rivera's jaw clenched, a silent agreement passing between them. The shipment wasn't just contraband, it was Reynolds' bid to cement his empire, to make himself untouchable. Failure wasn't an option. The port came into view, a sprawling maze of steel and shadow stretching along the waterfront. The air carried the briny tang of salt water, mingling with the faint sharpness of diesel fuel. Waves slapped against the docks, a rhythmic thud beneath the groan of cranes hoisting massive containers into the night sky. This was no sleepy harbor, it was a pulsing artery of trade, alive with movement even at this hour. But tonight, it was something else, a battlefield where justice would either prevail or crumble. Rachel's hand brushed the holster at her side, the cold metal grounding her as they pulled to a stop a few blocks from the main loading zone. She exchanged a quick nod with Rivera, and they slipped out of the vehicle, moving with the precision of hunters stalking prey. The ground beneath their feet was slick with oil and grime, the port's chaos unfolding around them. Workers in orange vests shouted over the din, oblivious to the drama lurking in the shadows. Rachel's eyes darted across the scene, picking out Reynolds' men among the crowd, their rigid postures, the way their hands hovered near concealed weapons. Her pulse hammered in her throat as she and Rivera wove through the labyrinth of shipping containers, their rusted surfaces towering overhead like silent sentinels. The air grew heavier, thick with the promise of confrontation. She could feel a storm brewing, the moment when everything would collide. "Stay close," she whispered to Rivera, her voice low but firm. "We move fast, get the intel, and get out. No heroics." He nodded, his eyes scanning the shadows, every muscle coiled with readiness. They were close now, so close she could taste the victory or the defeat waiting just beyond reach. Then she saw him, Reynolds, standing at the heart of it all, surrounded by his crew. He was a towering figure, his suit impeccably tailored despite the grime of the docks. His voice cut through the noise, sharp and commanding as he directed the unloading of the shipment. His eyes, cold and calculating, flicked to his watch, a flash of impatience crossing his face. This was his kingdom, and he ruled it without fear. Rachel crouched behind a stack of crates, Rivera at her side, both of them barely breathing as they watched. Her grip tightened on her gun, the weight of it a steady anchor in her trembling hands. Every nerve screamed at her to act, but she held back, waiting for the right moment. The tension was unbearable, a taut wire ready to snap. Reynolds' men moved with ruthless efficiency, their hands hauling crates from the ship's hold, their eyes darting for any sign of trouble. Rachel's mind raced, plotting their approach. This was the endgame where corruption would face its reckoning, where the abuse of power would either tighten its grip or be torn apart. She signaled Rivera to stay low, her heart pounding as they edged closer. Justice hung in the balance, and she'd fight with everything she had to tip the scales. The air hung thick with tension, a palpable silence stretching between Rachel and Rivera as they crouched behind a rusted shipping container. It wasn't a quiet born of peace, but one swollen with the weight of everything left unsaid and unspoken, pact forged through months of relentless pursuit. Words weren't necessary, their eyes locked briefly, a flicker of resolve passing between them like a torch in the dark. They both understood the gravity of what lay ahead, stakes towering higher than the stacks of crates surrounding them, the risks gnawing at the edges of their nerves. This wasn't just another operation, it was the culmination of sleepless nights, whispered plans, and sacrifices neither dared to voice. There was no retreat now, no second guessing. The path forward was a tightrope, and they'd committed to walking it together. Rachel's breathing remained steady, a disciplined rhythm she'd trained herself to maintain even as her mind churned like a storm at sea. She replayed the strategy in her head, every step etched into her thoughts with precision. Get to Reynolds, neutralize his men, avoid detection until the final moment. One misstep, a creak too loud, a shadow misplaced, and the entire plan could unravel, leaving them exposed in this labyrinth of steel and shadows. The port sprawled before them, a chaotic sprawl of towering containers and weathered wooden crates, their edges jagged against the dim glow of sodium lights. It was a perfect hideout, offering cover in its maze-like twists, yet it pulsed with danger. Every corner could conceal an enemy, every echo a threat. Rachel's pulse quickened at the thought of alerting Reynolds to soon. His wrath was a storm they couldn't afford to unleash before they were ready. A sudden shuffle of footsteps snapped her out of her reverie, her body tensing like a coiled spring. She whipped around, her hand darting to the cool grip of her sidearm, fingers brushing the metal as instinct took over. Her breath caught, her eyes narrowing until a familiar silhouette emerged from the gloom. Relief washed over her, though it didn't fully erase the tightness in her chest. It was Agent Stevens, his lean frame cutting through the shadows, his face etched with a grim determination that mirrored her own. One of the best on the team, Stevens had a reputation for keeping his cool under fire. A steady hand in the chaos, his whispered words came fast, urgent, slicing through the stillness. "Anderson, we've got your back. We're ready to move on your signal." His voice was low, but it carried the weight of a promise, his dark eyes glinting with a fierce loyalty that steadied her. Rachel nodded, her jaw tight as she forced her voice into a hushed, firm tone. "Keep it silent. We go when I give the word. This has to be flawless." Stevens dipped his head in acknowledgement, his expression unreadable but resolute, before melting back into the darkness like a phantom. Alone again with Rivera, Rachel's thoughts swung back to Reynolds. He was out there, oblivious to the noose tightening around him, a predator lounging in the illusion of invincibility. She pictured him now as casual slouch as he checked his watch for the third time, his sharp gaze sweeping the perimeter with the vigilance of a hawk. He exuded a relaxed confidence, but beneath it simmered a restless energy, as if he sensed something lurking just beyond his grasp. The tension coiled tighter in Rachel's chest, pressing against her ribs until it felt like she might crack under its weight. She'd faced danger before, countless operations, bullets grazing past, screams echoing in her ears, but this was different. This was personal. This was justice clawing its way to the surface. With a subtle flick of her hand, she signaled Rivera to crouch lower, his broad shoulders hunching as he obeyed without hesitation. It was time. She edged forward, her movements slow and deliberate, a predator stalking its prey. The containers loomed like silent sentinels, their rusted surfaces cold against her fingertips as she brushed past. Each step stretched into an agonizing eternity, the faint scrape of her boots against the concrete barely audible. Over the thudding of her own heart, she could see Reynolds now, just beyond the next row, his silhouette sharp against the flickering light, his presence radiating a smug authority. He was so close she could almost taste the victory, yet her throat tightened with the stakes of the moment. One chance, that's all she had. Steeling herself, Rachel drew a deep breath, her chest rising as she stepped out from the shadows. Her gun snapped up, steady in her grip, her voice cutting through the night like a blade. "Freeze, D. Drop your weapons." The world exploded into chaos, Reynolds' men whirled, hands fumbling for their guns, their shouts swallowed by the roar of adrenaline in her ears. But Rachel was already moving, her training a seamless dance of muscle and instinct. She squeezed off a warning shot, the crack splitting the air, a thunderclap that froze the men for a fleeting second. It was enough. She surged forward, her steps quick and calculated, every motion a testament to years spent honing her craft. Rivera flanked her, a shadow at her back, his own weapon raised as he scanned the periphery, his steady presence a lifeline in the storm. Reynolds stood rooted for a heartbeat, his composure fracturing as shock flickered across his angular face. But the mask slipped back into place almost instantly, his lips curling into a sneer that dripped with venom. "You think you can stop me?" He spat, his voice icy, cutting through the clamor like a shard of glass. "You're too late. I've already won." Rachel advanced, her boots striking the ground with purpose, her tone calm but unyielding. "It's over, Reynolds. You're finished. Surrender now, and you'll face the justice you've dodged for too long." His eyes narrowed, a storm brewing behind them, and his lip twisted into a cruel smile. "Over. You think I'll fall today? You've been chasing ghosts, little girl. No one stops me." Her fingers tightened around her gun, the cold metal grounding her as his arrogance fueled her resolve. She could feel the weight of his power, the empire he'd built on corruption and blood, the fear he'd wielded like a scepter. But she wouldn't falter. Not now, not after clawing her way through his labyrinth of lies. Without warning, Reynolds lunged, his hand flashing toward his waist. Rachel reacted in an instant, her shot ringing out, the bullet slamming into his shoulder. He staggered, a guttural curse escaping his lips as pain contorted his features. But he didn't fall. "You think a bullet stops me?" he snarled, his voice a jagged edge of fury and defiance. "I'm untouchable." Her heart hammered, but her focus never wavered. He wasn't wrong. Reynolds had always been a ghost, slipping through cracks in the system, shielded by wealth and terror. But today, those shields were crumbling. "It's over," she repeated, her voice a steel thread weaving through the chaos. His men circled like vultures, their hesitation palpable as they weighed their odds. Time was slipping away. She had to end this. The air crackled, electric with the clash of wills, as Reynolds glared at her, his eyes blazing with a hatred that could have ignited the night. "You don't get it," he hissed. "There's always another to take my place. You're not the first to try, and you won't be the last." Rachel's resolve hardened like tempered steel. She stepped closer, her gun unwavering, her voice a quiet storm. "Maybe, but not today. Not you." Time seemed to suspend, the world narrowing to the space between them. Reynolds' face twisted, disbelief, a flicker of something like fear as his hand twitched toward his sidearm. But Rivera was there, a silent guardian, his weapon trained on Reynolds' chest, his finger steady on the trigger. The distant wail of sirens swelled, a chorus of inevitability closing in. Backup had arrived, not just any team, but the final nail in Reynolds' coffin. His empire had no walls left to hide behind. For a moment, Reynolds froze, his fingers trembling as if daring fate one last time. Then, slowly, his hands rose, the gesture dripping with reluctant defeat. Silence fell, heavy and final. Rachel's chest tightened, her breath shallow as the weight of victory settled over her. Agents swarmed in, cuffing Reynolds, his smug defiance still etched into his features even as they dragged him away. She turned to Rivera, their eyes meeting in a wordless exchange, a nod, a shared breath, a recognition of what they'd achieved. But as Reynolds' footsteps faded into the warehouse, swallowed by the clatter of boots and the hum of justice, Rachel felt no triumph. Relief, yes, but it was tinged with a quiet unease. This wasn't the end, it was a chapter closed, a breath released after too long held. The fight against the rot he'd sown would stretch on, a shadow ever looming. The port buzzed around her now, agents securing the scene, voices barking orders over the distant pulse of the city. Stevens approached, his face softening into a rare smile. "You did it, Anderson." "We did it," she nodded, her expression still taut, the fire in her gut unquenched. "We're not done yet," she murmured, her gaze drifting back to the warehouse. Reynolds' arrest was a crack in the dam, but the flood of corruption ran deep. As she stood there, the weight of the night settling into her bones, Rachel knew one truth above all. Justice wasn't a single blow, it was a war. And every victory a lesson in the cost of power unchecked. The weariness etched into Rivera's face mirrored the exhaustion that pulsed through Rachel's every vein, a deep, bone-aching fatigue that seemed to settle into her very soul after the relentless storm they'd weathered together. Yet, beneath the heavy shadows under his eyes, she caught a flicker of something else, a quiet, unshakable satisfaction that glowed faintly, like an ember refusing to die out in the cold. They had done it. Against all odds, they had crossed the finish line side by side, and no force in the world could strip that triumph from them. Rachel's chest tightened with a mix of relief and pride as she studied him, the man who had become her rock through the chaos. "You good?" she asked, her voice dropping to a hushed, almost tender tone, softer now that the adrenaline had begun to ebb. Rivera tilted his head slightly, offering a small nod that carried more weight than words could convey. "Yeah, I'm good," he murmured, his gaze drifting inward for a moment. "Just still wrapping my head around it all." His eyes met hers again, searching. "You?" Rachel nodded, a slow, deliberate motion that spoke of the unspoken understanding between them. They had endured so much in such a fleeting span of time, days that felt like years, filled with danger that gnawed at their nerves, uncertainty that clouded every decision, and fear that lurked like a shadow at their heels. But now, standing in the aftermath, the storm had broken, at least for a breath. Reynolds, the man who had loomed over their lives like a dark titan, was in custody, his sprawling empire of corruption crumbling bit by bit, its jagged pieces scattering into the wind. The victory tasted sweet, but it was fleeting, a single note in a symphony that had yet to play out. "There's still so much left to do," Rachel said, her voice steady, but laced with the weight of reality. She cast a glance back at the team bustling behind her, their silhouettes moving against the dim light of the warehouse, securing the last scraps of evidence. "This is just one win. We've got to keep moving forward, can't let our guard down now. Her words hung in the air, heavy with purpose, and she saw them land on Rivera like a physical blow. His eyes darkened for a heartbeat, the lines on his face deepening as the truth sank in. This wasn't just a single battle for him. It was a war, a lifelong crusade he'd signed up for. Just as she had, the realization stirred something in her, a mix of admiration and quiet resolve. "I know," Rivera replied, his voice firm, unwavering, cutting through the stillness like a blade. "And I'm with you all the way." There was no hesitation in his tone, only a steely determination that sent a surge of gratitude through Rachel. She gave him a quick nod, a silent thank you for the loyalty she'd known from the moment they'd joined forces. Rivera wasn't just a partner, he was a kindred spirit, someone who grasped the stakes as keenly as she did, who wouldn't flinch when the ground beneath them trembled. In a fight like this, where the odds grew steeper with every step, that kind of ally was rarer than gold. As the team finished their work, sealing away the final traces of Reynolds' reign, Rachel took a lingering look around the warehouse. The cavernous space stretched out before her, its concrete floors stained with years of neglect, its walls looming cold and silent. When they'd first stormed in, it had felt like a fortress hostile, unyielding, a maze of secrets waiting to swallow them whole. Now, though, it carried a different weight. The air seemed lighter, the shadows less menacing, as if the place itself knew it had borne witness to something final. This was where it had all converged: sleepless nights, the calculated risks, the sacrifices that had carved pieces from their spirits. A wave of accomplishment washed over her, warm and fleeting, tempering the exhaustion that still clung to her limbs. She let herself feel it, just for a moment, before her mind snapped back to the road ahead. "We've still got Reynolds' network to tear apart," she said, turning to Rivera as they stepped toward the exit. "This won't be easy, but we've got the intel now. We just have to keep pushing." Her words were a vow as much as a plan, and Rivera met them with another nod, his jaw set with a resolve that mirrored her own. "We will," he said simply. "We'll get it done together." His certainty grounded her, a lifeline in the swirling sea of what-ifs that lay beyond the warehouse doors. Rachel exhaled slowly, savoring the fragile peace of their small triumph as they made their way to the vehicle. Outside, the city of Seattle sprawled beneath a graying sky, its streets alive with the hum of oblivious routine. Pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks, their faces buried in scarves or phones, while cars crawled through the evening traffic, horns bleating faintly in the distance. The world churned on, blissfully unaware of the war that had just been waged in the shadows of an old warehouse. And maybe that was how it should be, Rachel thought, her gaze drifting over the glittering skyline as the sun dipped low, painting the horizon in streaks of amber and ash. Maybe the true measure of their work was that the city didn't have to know that. Its people could live their lives, laugh with their friends, sip coffee in cozy cafes, all because she and Rivera and others like them bore the burden of its safety. But she knew, Rivera knew, and that knowledge was enough to keep them going. As they climbed into the car, the weight of the day settled over them like a heavy coat. Rachel leaned back in her seat, her eyes tracing the flickering lights of the city through the window. The streets pulsed with energy, a living tapestry of motion and noise, as if nothing had shifted. Yet she felt the change deep in her bones, hard-won peace they'd clawed from the jaws of chaos. It wasn't permanent, not by a long shot. Reynolds was just one head of a hydra, and with every empire they toppled, another would rise, its roots twisting through the underbelly of the world. Corruption didn't die, it adapted, slithering into new corners, donning new masks. That was the bitter truth of their reality, a truth that could crush the faint-hearted. But for Rachel, it was fuel. It was why she fought, not for glory, not for an end, but for the people who'd never see the cost. She glanced at Rivera, slumped in the front seat, his broad shoulders hunched with fatigue yet unbowed. His face, illuminated by the soft glow of passing streetlights, was a map of weariness and grit, his dark eyes fixed on the road ahead. "We did good today," she said quietly, her voice threading through the hum of the engine, a blend of pride and bone-deep tiredness. He turned to her, his gaze softening just enough to reveal the man beneath the soldier. "We did," he agreed, his tone rough but warm. "But the work's not done. Not yet. The weight of his words lingered, a reminder of the endless road stretching before them. There would always be another fight, another shadow to chase, another empire to dismantle. But that was what made it Matter's chance to carve out a sliver of justice, to shield even one soul from the darkness they battled. For a fleeting second, Rachel let a faint smile curve her lips, a rare crack in her armor as the city lights danced in the distance. Every fight exacted a toll, every step toward justice demanded a piece of them. But they pressed on for something greater than themselves, for the countless lives that would never know their names. In the passenger seat, Rivera shifted, his hands resting loosely on his knees, his mind no doubt churning through the same relentless questions that haunted her. What would come next? How many more would they have to face across from them, their Rivera weary? Sharp-eyed man named Torres kept his focus on the road, his fingers drumming lightly on the wheel. He'd been with them since the raid's first tense moments, a steady presence who'd cracked a rare grin when Reynolds' cuffs clicked shut. "You'd look like you could sleep for a week," Torres said, his voice dry but tinged with respect. "Hell of a day, though worth it." "Yeah," Rachel murmured, her thoughts drifting to the others who'd stood with them, the analysts poring over data in a cramped office, the undercover agents who'd risked everything to get them here. This wasn't just her victory, or Rivera's, it was theirs too, and beyond them. It belonged to the city itself, to the people who'd never grasped the price paid in their name. As the car wove through Seattle's labyrinth of streets, Rachel's mind turned to the broader lesson carved into this day. Justice wasn't a gift handed down, it was a fire forged through sacrifice, a flame that flickered but never died so long as someone was willing to tend it. Reynolds' fall was a stark reminder of what happened when power twisted into tyranny. How it preyed on the vulnerable, how it thrived in silence until someone dared to strike back. She and Rivera were that spark, but they weren't alone. The fight was long, the cost steep, but every step forward was a defiance of that corruption, a testament to the resilience of those who refused to yield. The city lights blurred past, a constellation of lives untouched by the battle she'd just fought. Rachel leaned her head against the cool glass, her breath fogging faintly against it. She didn't need the world to see her strugglingly to feel its quiet aftermath. And as Rivera's steady presence anchored her, as Torres' quiet strength steered them onward, she knew they'd keep going. One victory at a time, one shadow at a time. They'd hold the Linnebekhaus that was the heart of their fight, the soul of their justice.